But if you want to walk with God, you have no right to be offended. You have no right to be offended.
Meet John Bevere. He's going to lecture we the sheeple on how we are to tolerate the wolves in our lives and why. We're going to learn how to maintain healthy relationships with the predators in our life by not holding it against them when they attempt to destroy us. John is going to demand that we never be offended by the behavior of wolves, dogs, goats, and pigs. No, we the sheeple have no right to be offended by any behavior of any kind, no matter how evil it may appear to us. John's going to help us sheep people understand that being offended by wolf behavior is not only morally wrong, but also dangerous to our well-being. That anger you feel, you must understand, is in reality the bait of Satan. Being upset, agitated, offended toward wolves and their behavior opens the door to demonic activity, opens the door to demonic captivity. You know, captivity by those invisible little goblins that are a whole lot easier to blame for life's ills rather than other human beings or ourselves. Those demons will do the job the wolf couldn't if we don't let go of our resentment toward the wolf. So without further ado, here's Johnny.
You know, today I'm going to share with you a message that actually is in a book I wrote 20 years ago this year. It's its 20th anniversary. It's sold over 1 million copies. It's in over 50 languages. I really wish I had this message proclaimed to me 30 years ago. It really would have saved me some heartache. And so to introduce it, I'm going to share with you something that Jesus talked about with his disciples in Matthew 24. It has to do with the time period right before his second coming. How many of you believe we are living in that time period, that we're just before the second return of the Lord? Let me see your hand. Yeah, absolutely. So he's talking about our time period. And I want to open up with the 10th verse. I'm going to look at 10, 11, 12, and 13. Jesus said, and then many will be offended. Everybody say many. Many. Now the Greek word there for many literally means majority, so at least 51%. Many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another.
Yeah, let's look at Matthew. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Now then, rather than letting you take my word for it, allow me to share with you John Gill's interpretation of Matthew 24:10. If you've never heard of John Gill, look him up. Many consider him the greatest expositor of Scripture who ever lived. And here's what he said about Jesus' statement, "And then shall many be offended." That is, many who had been hearers of the apostles and professors of the Christian religion, who were highly pleased with it and were strenuous advocates for it while things were tolerably quiet and easy. What John here, I believe, is saying that, in other words, a whole lot of people professed Christ when things were going good, and they didn't have to suffer much for bearing his name. But when they saw the apostles, some of them beaten, some of them imprisoned, others put to death, and others forced to fly from place to place, and persecutions and affliction because of Christ and his gospel, likely to befall themselves, they would become discouraged and stumble at the cross and fall off from the faith of the gospel and the profession of it. When it became costly to be a Christian, that is when the offense occurs. Many professing Christians will find it offensive to be ostracized, offensive to be imprisoned, offensive to be beaten, offensive to live in isolation from place to place, and offensive to be put to death for his name's sake. Jesus was not even alluding to the type of offense John Bevere is talking about in his message. The offense Jesus is talking about is the falling away from faithfulness to God that takes place when the price becomes too high to follow him.
This is a progression. If you leave that up just for a second, an offended person will eventually betray, and if a betrayal, if it's not dealt with, will ultimately lead to hatred. You say, John, where do you get that? Proverbs 18, verse 19 says, a brother offended is harder to win than a strong city.
Proverbs 18:19 has absolutely nothing to do with Matthew 24, nor the offense to betrayal, betrayal to hatred progression that John is espousing.
If it's not dealt with, will ultimately lead to hatred. You say, John, where do you get that? Proverbs 18, verse 19 says, a brother offended is harder to win than a strong city. Now, in the days of Solomon, who wrote the book of Proverbs, what did strong cities have around them? Walls. What were the walls built for? Protection. They would keep out those people you believed were against you.
Uh-oh, here we go. Walls bad. Bridges good.
And then a person who thinks only about building walls, wherever they may be located, and not building bridges, is not a Christian.
This is exactly what a person does that has been hurt, that has been offended. They begin to build walls, but the New Testament doesn't call them walls. The New Testament calls them strongholds. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3, 4, and 5 tells us that these strongholds are thought processes or reasonings that we develop deep within our soul that are contrary to the word or the will of God.
Okay, let's attempt to unwind what John has just said. I've got to tell you, only 3 minutes into this video, and I already have a headache. The walls we construct to protect ourselves from people we think are against us. To quote Bevere, the walls spoken of in Proverbs 18:19, these walls of self-preservation are what the New Testament calls strongholds. These are the same strongholds we read about in 2 Corinthians 10. Let me tell you what John Bevere is doing here. John is employing a tactic used by so many false teachers before us and at this time. John is ascribing narrow, minute, and extremely specific meanings to English words that contain multi-layered connotation, multifaceted interpretation, and varying depths of nuance. And much like the word offense, the word stronghold is multifaceted in scope and significance. I could spend an entire week on the meaning of the word stronghold, penned by Paul in his letter to the Corinthians. So for the sake of time, I'll just give you a snippet of what John Gill wrote about the word in his commentary of 2 Corinthians 10:4. And I will use this definition because I think it applies to John Bevere. Strongholds means fleshly wisdom, rhetorical eloquence, and sophisms of false teachers with which they endeavor to fortify themselves against the doctrines of the gospel.
Now, how many of you know that God's word is rooted in his nature? And his nature is love, right? He doesn't have love, he is love, right? So the love of God, the word of God, is always seeking to give, to give, to give. However, a person that's been hurt, they've been offended, now develops thought processes and reasonings that seek to protect, protect, protect.
Hey, John, that's what we look to you for, to protect, protect, protect. Does John understand one of the chief duties as a minister of the gospel is to protect, protect, protect God's sheep? It's easy to give information. You're quite adept at it, John. It's a little more risky, particularly where one's bottom line is concerned, to actually protect Christ's sheep from wolves within and wolves without the flock. I think John knows this. I think this is why John wants you to believe protecting yourself and others is somehow or other a bad thing. But it takes John off the hook. It takes John Bevere off the hook from having to fulfill the shepherd's responsibility to protect, protect, protect.
Now, the reason that doesn't make sense to many of you is our misguided understanding of betrayal. Most of us only know betrayal in the extreme sense. Benedict Arnold, Judas. But let me tell you what a definition of a betrayal is. A betrayal is when I seek my protection or benefit at the expense of one I have a relationship with.
No, John, let me tell you what a definition of betrayal is. I won't pull my definition out of thin air like you did. To give into the hands of another, to give over into one's power or use, to deliver one something to keep, use, take care of, or manage, to deliver up one to custody, to deliver up one to be judged, to deliver up one to be condemned, to deliver up one to be punished, to deliver up one to be scourged, to deliver up treacherously. Do you see a common theme in Strong's definition? To give into the hands of another, to give over into another's power to use, to deliver up treacherously. Kind of fits Jesus' narrative from Matthew 24:9 when he said, they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. And that's the definition I'm going to stick with. That's the definition that fits Jesus' narrative, not John Bevere's agenda.
A betrayal is an ultimate abandonment of a relationship.
I don't know, maybe John is unaware of cases in which the abandonment of a relationship is an act of obedience toward God. Take 2 Timothy 3, which instructs us to turn away from those who have a form of godliness, but who deny its power. I'll once again turn to John Gill's exposition of the phrase, "From such turn away, have no fellowship with them. Depart from their communion. Withdraw from them. Come out from among them." Then John Gill says something interesting. He states the following: "This passage sufficiently justifies the Reformed churches in their separation from the Church of Rome." Which leads me to a question for John Bevere. Was the great Protestant Reformation an act of betrayal in the eyes of God? I mean, according to your definition of betrayal, the Protestant movement was an abandonment of a relationship with the Roman Catholic Church, correct? Was the Great Schism from Rome initiated by Martin Luther and continued by John Calvin, Zwingli, and other Protestant reformers in the 16th century Europe? Was that an act of abandonment? Was that an act of betrayal? Did Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli have a right to be offended by Roman Catholic dogma and authority? Did they have a right to turn away from it?
Now, you know what that tells me is that an offended heart is the breeding ground for deception.
An offended heart is the breeding ground for deception. No, it's not, John. A heart that does not receive the love of the truth is the breeding ground for deception. We find this in 2 Thessalonians. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and then get this, with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth. I'll tell you who has a heart that's a breeding ground for deception. It's the man who loves riches more than he loves God. It's the religious leader who loves prestige more than he loves truth. I'll tell you who has a heart that's a breeding ground for deception. People offended by the price they must pay in order to be a true follower of Jesus. These are the folks whose hearts are the breeding ground for deception. I wonder if it would surprise John to know people who love truth are offended by those who hate truth. Would John be shocked to learn people who strive to practice truth are offended by those committed to the practice of deception?
If you've been genuinely mistreated, do you have the right to be offended? Well, let me make this clear. You have the right to do anything because God's given us a free will. But if you want to walk with God, you have no right to be offended.
If you want to walk with God, you have no right to be offended. If this is true, that we don't have a right to be offended, then Jesus himself is in trouble. I say this because I read in Matthew 13 that Jesus is going to gather out of his kingdom all things that offend. Apparently, Jesus must not have read John's book. Doesn't Jesus know he has no right to be offended? That's if he wants to walk with the Father. Doesn't Jesus know an offended heart is the breeding ground for deception? I don't know, perhaps John Bevere needs to set Jesus straight. Maybe give him a copy of his best-selling book. No, John's blanket statement concerning the rights of God's people, it's an affront. It's an affront to those who've been spiritually and psychologically devoured by the wolves in their life. It's an affront to Christ. It's an affront to common sense. And it's an affront to me. John Bevere's a hypocrite. I mean, he's a hypocrite of the nth, highest degree. He has a huge, gaudy 2x4 in his eye. But he's going to point out the speck in yours. Listen, I get that we're not to go around life offended by every little thing that happens to us. We would be men and women most miserable if we did that. Common sense dictates that. There are different forms of anger. There are different reasons for anger. The variables are infinite. We are to turn over our desire for vengeance to God. I get that too. Actually, that is a part of forgiveness. When it's impossible for justice to be served through the government or municipalities, it is a comfort to know that our God in heaven will actually execute vengeance for those of us who may have been oppressed. Hence, to walk around offended all the time, it isn't good. But this country, our culture's in a mess. Have you noticed that? We're in a mess in America. We are falling apart at the seams fast. And it's messages like John Bevere's, messages like that are the reason why. We tolerate everything. Here in the United States, we are being taught to tolerate everything, every form of perversion, violence. And that's a major reason why his book, The Bait of Satan, is so, and I'm going to use the term, offensive to me. We need to get a little more offensive about the wickedness that's surrounding us. And I'll tell you what's truly wicked. The most wicked of all are these false, covert, psychopathic, and narcissistic Christian teachers placing burdens, placing doctrines upon God's true people that enslave them, much like the Pharisees. That's true evil. Men who have a form of godliness but don't allow God to rule over their own hearts. Yet they're going to lord it over you. That's offensive. That's highly offensive to me. And it should be to you. People who abuse their authority is offensive to me. It's offensive to God. I'll tell you, the most offended person in all this is John Bevere, though. And this is where the hypocrisy comes in. It offends John. The very thought of having to protect sheep from wolves is offensive to John because it's sticky, dirty, gritty work. In order to protect God's sheep from predators involves having close, intimate relations with those nasty, dirty sheep, the commoners. And I don't think John wants to do that. I think that is offensive to him. John wants to hang out. John and his wife Lisa want to hang out with the Daystar and the TBN crowd. Not us commoners. It's offensive to John. It's highly offensive to him to carry out the edict of Jesus himself. To guard against wolves in sheep's clothing, to guard against false brethren, to call out false brethren, to call out false teachers, to expose them and kick them out. John's going to lose a lot of money if he decides to do that. And he knows it. And it's offensive to him. He likes his prestige. He likes his prestige. He likes the fact that his book is a bestseller. It grieves me to know that his book has been read by so many people because it's absolute rubbish. Well, thank you for watching this video. I hope you pray as you're watching it and, judge what I'm saying. Judge what I'm saying. Pray over what I'm saying. I might be missing it. I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best to shatter a lot of the false doctrine I believe I see out there. But I might be wrong too. I don't know. There's so much disinformation. So I'm asking you to pray. And judge what I've said. And I do thank you for watching and putting up with me. Thank you.